No storm had ever seemed as furious as the one storming that night on the ancient stones of Dartmoor. The Vance family manor's slate roof was battered by rain, and every wind blow caused the ancient timbers to groan as though they were recalling all the sorrows that had ever descended upon these moors. Lady Eleanor Vance was inside, pressing her palm against the window's icy glass, her reflection broken by raindrops. The storm within her was still more intense than the one outside, even after all these months. She was once a champion, a favourite on the show jumping circuit in England, with her name being applauded in crowded stadiums and her face appearing in magazines. She now went through these chilly hallways like a ghost, plagued by the fatal accident that claimed her beloved mare, Nightfall, and destroyed not only her leg but also the life she had built on danger, glory, and horses. Eleanor barely noticed the crackle of a fire in the fireplace behind her. All she could see was her own image, slender and worn out, with dark circles around her eyes and haphazardly tied hair. As she reached for the mug of tea she had left hours earlier, her hands, which had once been solid enough to get even the most hesitant horse to jump, suddenly trembled. The sky was divided by furious, white lightning. The crystal in its shelves rattled as thunder shook the walls. Eleanor's thoughts sank more into recollection with every blast, the instant her foot slipped, Nightfall's terrified cry, the agonizing silence that followed. As with every storm, she wished she could somehow turn back time as she leaned her forehead against the glass. The world was crazy outside. Rain battered the gardens, wind ripped at the limbs of old oaks, and something, perhaps a fox, dashed across the lane in the distance, just perceptible in the darkness. Eleanor made an effort to concentrate on the storm. Anything to keep her head from spinning with remorse. A shrill, high-pitched scream pierced the darkness. She initially believed she had dreamed it. However, it returned, this time more intense, more raw, and so full of pain that Eleanor could feel it in her bones. It was a horse's scream, not just a whinny, but something wild and frantic, like the moor itself calling for aid. Her chest pounded with her heart. She had occasionally seen the silhouettes of the local Dartmoor ponies in the distance, as the Vance estate was close to the most untamed area of Dartmoor. She had never heard such a sound before, and they hardly ever approached. One part of Eleanor's instincts told her to shut the door, stay secure, and let nature take its course. The other, older part, which had once jumped confidently onto the backs of strong beasts, told her to leave. She froze for a second, breathing heavily and sinking her fingers into the window sill. The tempest inside her shouted even louder as the storm outside. But it was impossible to ignore that sound, that awful cries for help. She grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight, put on her muddy boots, and threw on her waxed jacket. As she rushed down the hallway and out into the darkness, the old pain in her leg flared up. Her face was pummeled by cold rain. Fear almost caused her to back away as she paused on the porch, half blinded by the wind. However, the scream returned, this time less loud but still audible. Boots slipping on mossy stones, Eleanor pushed herself onward, staggering across the gravel. Every step was an effort to fight against the agony, the memories that were tearing at her brain, and the innate fear of going out into a storm that may engulf her. Only the closest shrubs and the whirling sheets of rain were illuminated by the wild dancing beam of her flashlight. With her heart pounding and her breath hazy in the chilly air, she followed the shouts. The terrain slopped down to the moor beyond the garden's boundary, where bracken and gorse formed a tangled maze. There was a life suffering somewhere. Reading the terrain and listening through the wind, the old horsewoman's sense took control. For a brief while, she glimpsed a black form thrashing against the low fence at the edge of the land as another lightning bolt illuminated the sky. The animal was little for a horse, with a wild mane and a rain-slick coat. Fear and excitement pumping through her, Eleanor staggered toward it. The animal's hind leg was streaked with blood as she got closer. Instead of being hooked on barbed wire, the pony, a pure Dartmoor with a strong, blocky body and a wild expression in its eye, was caught on something worse. Its lower leg was tightly held by a gleaming, vicious, steel jaw trap. The animal's frantic struggles tore into the dirt. Eleanor was paralyzed for a second. The last minutes of nightfall, the sound of bone breaking, and the searing, metallic tang of blood were all memories that came flooding back to her. She almost dropped the flashlight because her hands were shaking so badly. The pony's terrified eyes went white. Eleanor flinched back, heart in her throat, as it swung out, almost hitting her. "Simple. Easy there," she muttered in a raspy voice. Her face was stung by rain. The mechanism of the trap, covered in gore and muck, was revealed by another lightning strike. She paused, conflicted. The pony might bleed out if she fled for assistance. She might get booted or worse if she attempted to assist on her own. Eleanor, however, had endured too much remorse. She couldn't stand by and see another animal perish. Legs hurting, she rushed back to the stable and dug through her old equipment, which included a lead rope, wire cutters, and heavy gloves. The pony had fallen to its knees, sides heaving, blood mingling with the rain when she got back. Eleanor gasped in surprise. She circled wide, spoke in calming tones, and moved slowly, just as she had done 1,000 times with scared horses. Despite shivering, the animal remained motionless. Ignoring the agony in her own leg, Eleanor knelt down to work on the trap. For her and the pony, every second was a torment. She cursed as her fingers slipped and she fumbled with the slippery metal. Finally, the jaws opened, and the pony stumbled free, almost toppling her in its fright. Rain engulfed its shape as it hobbled into the night, but not before a strange flash of lightning showed Eleanor a brand scorched into the flesh above its haunch, a symbol she had never seen before. Eleanor stared, trembling and soaked, as the pony disappeared into the storm. For a moment, the only sounds in the universe were her own labored breathing and the distant thunder. Her heart grieved for all of her past transgressions as much as for the creature. The dance of life and death continued somewhere on the moor. Once more, Eleanor was a part of that untamed, brutal ballet. Thus, both inside and outside, the storm continued to rage. Every inch of fabric against Eleanor's flesh became a frigid burden as the cold seeped through her jacket. Breathing quickly and shallowly, she stumbled back across the wet yard, her boots slipping on stones and slick patches of grass. As she rushed to the tack room, the beam of the flashlight jiggled across the soaked terrain. There was no time for doubt or fear, even if her hands were still shaking and every joint was screaming. Every step she took was plagued by the vision of that small Dartmoor pony, its limbs severed, its eyes wild, abandoned to perish in the storm. She almost stumbled over an old blanket pile in the tack area. The smell of dust, liniment, and leather filled the air. After searching a battered metal toolbox, she eventually found a bottle of antiseptic spray, thick riding gloves, a battered halter, and her old farrier's wire cutters. For a brief moment, she stopped as she noticed an old picture tacked above the workstation, she smiling on top of nightfall, both of them shining with pride and health, ribbons hanging from the bridle. Eleanor's throat became constricted. She murmured, "No time for the past," and hobbled back out into the storm. As she walked back to the fence, lightning shook the sky. The wind had changed, it now sounded as if it were coming directly from the moor, shaking trees and conveying the smell of wet bracken and peat. The small pony was fallen in the mud, its sides flecked with foam and blood, and its chest heaving. When she got close, it pulled its head up, rolling its eyes and pinning its ears. "Whoa, that's simple. Easy now," she whispered, using a steady, low voice that had been refined by years of riding. The animal's legs shook and its nostrils flared. Now she could see the blood and dirty water gathering beneath the deep cuts made by the steel teeth. She recoiled at the sight, a wound that would come back to haunt her. She put on her gloves and slipped closer, her hands shaking. The last protection against the pain and the strange guy closing in was the pony's feeble lashing out with its free leg. The animal's fear appeared to be reflected in the storm's rage. The crunch of bone, the moist grass, and the world spinning as nightfall fell were all memories of that night in the arena that briefly returned to Eleanor's consciousness as the wind swirled around her. She gripped the wire cutters tighter. She told herself, not this time. She investigated the trap while kneeling so as not to startle the pony. It wasn't some rusting relic, it was a modern mechanism made of heavy-duty, springy steel. Even in the gloom, its jaws flashed with ruthless efficiency. Nerves frayed as the pony's fright increased, her hands fumbled with the release mechanism. She muttered, more to herself than to the animal, "Almost there, sweetheart, almost." A very strong wind shook the fence. The pony thrashed and screamed, almost kicking Eleanor's arm in desperation. An adrenaline rush occurred. Eleanor froze for a second, instinct telling her to back off, but she wouldn't go. With a wet, metallic crack, the steel trap finally sprung open after she reached again and succeeded in levering the jaws apart. The pony thrashed, almost knocking Eleanor over, and shouted, a sound that would haunt her in her nightmares. Her hands were covered in blood, and her jacket's cuffs were stained. Mud soaked through Eleanor's jeans as she caught herself on the fence. With its sides heaving, the small horse stumbled and then stumbled to its feet. It stood there for a moment, its eyes wild and wide, its legs spread wide. With hardly more than a whisper, Eleanor replied, "Go on, get out of here." The pony gave one last snort before limping into the night, and disappearing into the rain. Breathing heavily, Eleanor fell to her knees. She gritted her teeth despite the sharp pain shooting up her damaged leg. A surge of emotions crashed over her as she saw the dark shape go into the whirling storm, relief, fear, and an unexpected, painful hope. The animal might survive. Perhaps, for once, she had done something correctly. She blinked rain and tears from her eyes as she stumbled to her feet. She discovered that her hands were shaking so much that she could hardly hold the flashlight while she wiped her face. The stinging scrape on her wrist served as a reminder of how close she had been to getting harmed herself, and her own blood mixed with the pony's. After muttering a curse, she chuckled at the ridiculousness of being out here, soaked to the bone, battling ghosts in the teeth of a Dartmoor storm. She was about to limp back toward the manor when the sky was illuminated by lightning once more, shedding light on the grass and muck. The world froze for a moment, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip a beat, a dark, uneven mark that was burned onto the pony's flank right above the wound. She didn't identify the brand from any nearby breeders. Blood and dirt obscured what appeared to be a symbol, something ancient and secret. The animal had already vanished into the night when she opened her mouth to call for it. Her heart pounded. By the time she managed to get her phone out and turn on the flashlight again, all that was left were bloody water and hoofprints. A chilly knot of fear settled in her stomach as she gazed after the pony. Such a mark is inappropriate for any wild pony. She was still standing when Winston, her old gelding, appeared out of the shadows, whinnying nervously from the stable yard, his eyes whitened and his ears pricked. With a raspy voice, Eleanor said, "It's okay, old man. A little excitement, please." Her thoughts racing, she guided Winston back to the barn. A deep, bone weariness took the place of the exhilaration. After taking off her soaked garments, she threw them in the washing sink and made herself wash her hands of the blood. She was trembling all over as she looked at her image in the bathroom mirror, not just from the cold but also from the memory of the pony's eyes, which had a wild, beseeching intelligence, as though the animal had grasped she was its only hope. It was hard to sleep the remainder of the night. Eleanor walked down the corridors, reliving each scene. Did she go far enough? Would the wound kill it and cause an infection before dawn? She dreamed of steel traps clicking shut, of nightfall, of wild horses galloping through fog, and of that ancient, bone-deep guilt that weighed like a stone in her breast when she finally fell upon her bed. She knew what she needed to do by the time the sky started to lighten. This time, she couldn't let it go. There were still mysteries on the moor, and a small pony was struggling for its life someplace. Even though she was limping and bruised, Eleanor Vance refused to let it battle alone. The world was painted in shades of slate and pearl as the mist rolled in heavy and low, and the morning on Dartmoor began as a gloomy, melancholy promise. Due to her nerves after the previous night's experience, Eleanor had hardly slept. The blood pooling in the rain, the flash of lightning displaying that unknown brand, and the frantic cries were all replayed in her head. She was already dressed in muddy trousers, thick socks, and a faded flannel shirt, shoulders set with grim purpose, when the first weak light filtered through the curtains. Even though her damaged leg was still hurting, it only made her determination stronger. This was something that could not be avoided. Not right now. She picked up Winston's halter, a faded oilskin coat, and her phone. The elderly gelding in the barn snickered as though he had been anticipating her arrival all night. Eleanor patted his wide neck and remarked, "We have work to do, boy." Out on the untamed moor, she trusted Winston's instincts since he was solid yet slow. The brambles and grass tufts were covered with dew, and the air was moist and cold. The land along the fence line was a churned mess of mud, blood, and hoofprints, and the ground was covered in broken limbs that had been ripped away by the storm. Kneeling, Eleanor examined the traces. The ground was drenched with the blood of the small Dartmoor pony that had battled for its life here. The thin but discernible trail led off in the direction of the moor's center. She was only momentarily hesitant. Even though she knew there was little possibility of finding the animal alive, she persisted because she remembered its frightened, frantic eyes. She got on Winston's back and encouraged him to walk carefully. Within minutes, the mist engulfed them as they followed the paths, finding their way through tangled gorse and swampy spots. Although Dartmoor was never really quiet, all sounds sounded muffled now. Sheep hunkered on the higher land, their fleece darkened by rain, while crows called in the distance. Eleanor's breath was evident in the morning coolness as her boots brushed damp ferns. This was a region where secrets may easily be lost forever. It was a lovely but harsh land. The tracks were less noticeable as they continued, almost disappearing into the muddy earth. A tuft of dark mane caught on a thorn bush, a new scratch on a rock, or another patch of blood might occasionally catch Eleanor's attention. Her voice was low and comforting as she spoke to Winston, more to calm herself than anything else. "I am aware of how close we are. Just a bit more." Winston stopped abruptly, his body tight and his ears pricked. Eleanor noticed they weren't alone after following his gaze. A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a worn cap, sturdy boots, and a waxed green jacket appeared out of the mist. He had a battered canvas bag on his back and a wooden walking stick in one hand. His face was solemn and lined from years spent on the moor. With an obvious Devon accent, he murmured, "Lady Vance," his blue eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. "I didn't think I'd see you out here at this hour." It was the park ranger from the area, Arthur Penhaligon, who was also somewhat of a legend. With only a compass and a stubborn streak, he had previously rescued a family of stranded hikers from a blizzard and knew Dartmoor like the back of his hand. Eleanor forced a calmness she didn't feel by straightening in the saddle. "Good morning, Arthur. I'm trying to find a pony that is hurt. Caught last night in a trap on my property." He first looked at the blood on her trousers, and then he looked at the ground, where the red-stained grass and muddy trails told their own tale. Most people would have been content to leave things alone. "These moors after a storm are dangerous business," he said. Despite her anger at the condemnation in his voice, Eleanor looked him in the eye. "I couldn't let it die," she said. Without expressing approval or disapproval, Arthur grunted. He knelt next to the footprints and rubbed the ground with a rough palm. "I have already encountered traps like that. There have been more of these recently. These horses have caught the attention of someone, and not for a good cause." The croak of a distant raven was the only sound to break the hush that had descended between them. Arthur stood up and continued, "You city people usually avoid this area of Dartmoor. Why is one wild pony so important to you?" With the inquiry rubbing against old scars, Eleanor paused. She averted her gaze and observed the fog twisting through the gnarled oaks. There are moments when you notice something in their eyes. Something valuable to preserve. After giving her a long look, Arthur nodded. "All okay. I'll assist you in looking." Arthur moved with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up on these hills as they walked the trail together. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor regarded him, appreciative of the companionship but yet cautious because she was still an outsider here and her presence on the moor was viewed with more mistrust than acceptance. Arthur informed her of recent poaching instances as they strolled together, reports of unidentified car tracks, missing foals, and rumors circulated in rural pubs of eerie individuals searching the moor at night. "What sort of individual does that?" Eleanor inquired, her voice growing irate. Arthur gave a headshake. "Some claim it's the cash. Nowadays, rare animals can demand a high price. Others point the finger at collectors, foreigners, and those with more money than common judgment." He stopped and looked at her. "Your neighbour, Lord Blackwood, has been fussing over it lately. Alleges that outsiders have been intruding on his property. Set up cameras, hired more men, and so on. Claimed that he was only safeguarding his stock, but..." Arthur scowled as he trailed off. Eleanor had a racing mind. The name Lord Alistair Blackwood conjured her images of old money, authority, and a sense of entitlement that made her skin crawl. Since fleeing to Dartmoor, she had only encountered him a few times, and each time she found his smile too piercing and his manners too slick. "Was he able to report the traps?" she inquired. Arthur gave a headshake. "Not that I'm aware of. Only the intruders. It's funny, though. The only location where these traps have not appeared is Blackwood's mansion." Eleanor felt a chill of mistrust tickle the back of her neck. Her breath caught as she gazed into the fog. Her voice was tense as she said, "We have to find that pony." Arthur looked at the horizon and nodded. "I'll investigate the lower gully. The ridge is yours. Tell me if you see anything at all. And Lady Vance, use caution. It's not just the storms that bite out here." Eleanor continued, her heart racing, the parts of a bigger, darker picture starting to fit together as he vanished into the mist. She would track down Storm and discover who had brought such evil to these untamed, desolate hills. And she refused to run this time. No matter what secrets Dartmoor attempted to conceal, she would fight for the living and the spirits of her past. The untamed hills of Dartmoor became a world of changing shadows and whispered secrets as the mist hung low and heavy, engulfing shape and sound. Boots, squelching in the sodden peat, Eleanor pushed onward, every muscle taut with expectancy and exertion. The smells of distant heather, damp grass, and something sharper, blood, perhaps, or the bitter tang of fear, were all present in the thick, chilly air against her face. At the ancient stone cross, she had said goodbye to Arthur, who was heading down into the lower gullies when his silhouette was swiftly engulfed by the fog. Eleanor's pulse pounded with a mix of fear and hope as she turned to face the crest. Winston accompanied her as she traveled, grounded by the gelding's steady presence, whose ears flicked at every distant cry or twig crack. The terrain was rugged, with abrupt drops concealed by bracken, and old sheep trails slicing across it. Eleanor made herself walk carefully, looking at each hollow and dip. Her pulse went into overdrive when a scared pheasant suddenly exploded from a patch of fern. In an attempt to relax, she whispered, "Get a grip." When she discovered the first new sign, a smear of blood on a mossy rock, the print of a little hoof pushed deep in the mud, she nearly convinced herself she had lost the track entirely. Eleanor knelt down and ran her fingertips across the mark. The pony couldn't get far because the wound was still bleeding. Her breath came more quickly as she followed the trail as it curved around the edge of a rocky outcrop. She briefly saw something dark resting in a hole between two boulders when the fog briefly lifted. She stopped. For a horrible moment, she believed it was too late because the shape was so motionless. With anguish and frustration rushing over her, Eleanor's throat closed. Half afraid of what she might discover, she stepped forward on wobbly legs. However, the pony, Storm, she concluded, since nothing else matched the strong spirit she'd seen, stirred as she approached, nostrils twitching. With a low, guttural moan of pain, he fell back down after attempting to stand. His flank was smeared with mud and blood, and the branded mark on his hip, a weird, looping glyph that was partially concealed by crusted blood and dirt, was suddenly more visible. Ignoring the cold, Eleanor dropped to her knees in the damp grass. "Hey, boy. I'm not here to cause you any harm. Don't you remember me from last night?" Her voice was quiet and comforting. She extended her hand, but Storm's eyes became white as he bared his teeth and whipped his tail. She paused and waited with her hands up. She was wise enough not to push it. She had learned the importance of patience, and allowing the animal determine, when it was ready to trust from years of working with anxious jumpers. The rain trickled down her face as she knelt in the mud for what seemed like hours. With a pounding chest, Storm observed her. He finally let his head down with a shuddering moan, fear giving way to tiredness. Clutching forward, Eleanor whispered softly so he could smell her. Feeling the tremble of his skin beneath her palm, she placed her touch softly on his neck. "That's it. Simple, simple," she muttered. She studied the wound slowly. It was not hopeless, but it was horrible. The area was heated and inflamed, but the bleeding had largely ceased. For now, she had to get Storm back on his feet, or at least make him comfortable enough to rest and recover, even though infection was a definite possibility. With a sympathetic squirm, she removed the antiseptic spray as Storm recoiled from the sting. His strength was gone when he tried to bite. Using a strip cut from her own shirt, Eleanor wrapped the leg as best she could while working swiftly to remove the worst of the dirt and grime. She continued to speak to him incessantly, offering consolation and nonsense. "Aren't you a tough cookie? Despite everything, I'm still alive. You survive out here that way." Overhead, a crow's voice resounded through the fog. Winston blew softly as he observed from a few yards away. Eleanor gave him a quick glance before turning back to Storm. "How about we try to get you out of this hollow?" She wrapped the halter around Storm's neck very slowly. He trembled but did not struggle. He stumbled and almost fell when she tried to get him to stand. He was so close to giving up that her heart tightened. After that, something changed. Perhaps it was the quiet nickering of Winston or the way Eleanor's hand never left his shoulder, but Storm pulled himself together, legs shaking, and forced himself to stand. He leaned heavily against her for a moment, almost toppling her. As she talked him through it, she braced, feeling the muscles beneath his skin shift and bunch. One faltering step, then another. In sympathy, Eleanor's own leg ached, but she held on. "Storm, you're doing fantastically. Just a bit more." One slow step at a time, she guided him up out of the hollow and toward the firmer ground near the ridge with unending care. With sides heaving, Storm halted as they came to the crest and turned to face Eleanor. Something flickered between them for a heartbeat, perhaps recognition or simply a flash of mutual stubbornness. He pressed his nose against her hand and exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Unexpectedly, tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. She had never been let in by a horse, even for a brief moment, since the accident. She laughed softly as she used the back of her hand to wipe her face. "Boy, I guess you're stuck with me now." She quickly took a picture of the odd brand on Storm's hip with her phone before sending it to her email for storage. She couldn't get the symbol out of her head, a warning, a clue, or perhaps both. As the fog closed in behind them, Eleanor walked slowly back toward home, Storm limping at her side and Winston steady on her other. Danger still existed somewhere out there, someone had set the trap, and there was a reason why they were keeping an eye on these ponies. But for the moment, Eleanor felt hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the mist. No matter how gloomy the moor or how profound its secrets were, she vowed to see this through for Storm and herself. That afternoon, the fog never really lifted, but instead coiled itself into gentle, enduring ribbons across the moor, drowning out both sound and thought. In a peaceful area of the stable, Eleanor cared for Storm for hours. Even though he trembled from agony and tiredness, he allowed her to touch him now that his eyes were calmed down. As she cleaned his wound, took his temperature, and gave him sips of water from a damaged bucket, she spoke softly to him. As if to remind them both that he was still in charge of the barn, Winston would occasionally stick his grey snout over the barrier. For the first time since the experience started, Storm was safe and motionless by evening. With her body hurting in every joint and her spirit torn between fear and hope, Eleanor slumped against the stall door. An automated out-of-office response was all she received when she emailed the image of Storm's peculiar brand to an old acquaintance who had worked with animal protection in London. Restlessly, her thoughts whirled around unanswered questions. The doorbell rang while she was still deep in meditation. It was a harsh, unnatural sound, a courteous chime, far too refined for such a setting. Curious, she dried her hands, combed her hair, and hobbled to the front door over the chilly stone floor. Lord Alistair Blackwood was standing on the threshold. Tall and slender in a superbly tailored dark tweed coat, he made a striking impression, his silver hair held in place even in the damp. There was nothing he missed with his pale blue, almost grey eyes. He grinned, but it was a cold, rehearsed smile made entirely of teeth. "Lady Vance," he said with ease and the smallest bow. "Pardon me for interrupting without warning. As a good neighbour should, I decided I should finally introduce myself when I was out inspecting the lower fields. Could I enter?" Eleanor paused. She felt uneasy about him, but she couldn't help but be attracted to the most influential landowner in the area, especially since he was so good at playing the part of courteous nobility. "Lord Blackwood, of course," she said, stepping aside. "Enter. Do you want tea?" He grinned once again as he walked carefully across the threshold and looked around the hallway with the critical eye of someone accustomed to ownership. "Tea would be delicious. It is a ferocious afternoon outside." With steady hands but a racing heart, she brought him to the sitting room, kindled a little fire, and made a pot of Earl Grey. She sensed his calm, evaluating stare following her. As she worked, he struck up a conversation with her about the weather, the house's history, and the untamed beauty of Dartmoor, all in the relaxed, melodic style of the British upper class. However, the talk was far from casual on the inside. Alistair sipped his cup calmly and continued, "I hear you had a bit of excitement last night. Arthur Penhaligon made reference to a pony that was stuck in a trap. These are nastier traps." Eleanor peered over the edge of her cup at him. "Indeed. Who set it is still a mystery to me." With a tone that was almost empathetic, he answered, "Oh, These moors attract all sorts, I'm afraid. Wealthy individuals from the continent and even the Middle East are collectors who are willing to pay a premium for uncommon lineages. It really is a catastrophe. You understand how hard it might be to patrol every acre, but I try my best to keep poachers off my property. He left the words lingering. Mind your own business was the message that Eleanor heard woven through the fabric. Nevertheless, he added, it's crucial to control these untamed herds. Out of control, ferocious animals can be harmful. Have you noticed anything? What's odd about the pony you discovered? Eleanor stiffened. The true reason he had come was there. She pushed her face into neutral politeness. There is nothing more peculiar than the trap's brutality. To be honest, I didn't get much sleep. Animals become restless during storms. Alistair's grin grew angular. Yes, I suppose that's what storms do to us all. If I were you, I would exercise caution. You're not from this area. There are restrictions on the moor, and occasionally visitors can get lost. The silence was broken when a log burst into the fire. Eleanor put down her cup and looked up into his eyes. Thank you, Lord Blackwood, for your worry. However, I rode these moors as a child. I am aware of what I am doing. His gaze swept across her, seemingly assessing her soul. Well, I see. Well, do let me know if you see anything unusual, like a pony with a characteristic mark or behavior. Certain collectors have extremely specific preferences. I'm trying my hardest to protect Dartmoor from the wrong kind. He could see Eleanor's tenacity, as she maintained eye contact. Obviously. He wiped invisible dust off his sleeve, got up, and drank his tea. Thank you, Lady Vance, for your hospitality. Now that you've made the decision to remain a while, I hope we'll see each other more. I take my responsibilities as this land's caretaker extremely seriously. You should, too. He walked confidently to the door and stopped just outside the threshold. Take caution. Out here, accidents do occur, particularly during inclement weather. Then, with one more piercing grin, he disappeared into the fog. Unaware that she had been holding her breath, Eleanor released it. Her heart thumped with rage instead of dread. He had come to scare her away, to threaten her, and to find out more about Storm. The worried neighbour's mask was just that, a mask. Suspicion and resolve whirled through her head as she made her way back to the stable. Storm looked up and gave a quiet nicker as she checked on him. Her rage solidified into something colder and tougher as she rubbed his mane. She muttered, "You're safe for the time being. However, I will not allow him or anybody else to take you." Eleanor saw a fresh fire igniting in her chest, despite the fog and the moor's somber, hidden atmosphere outside. Alistair Blackwood, ominous threats, or the wounds from her own past would not scare her away. She was going to fight? For the terrain itself, for Storm, and for the untamed horses. She also understood exactly who she was up against for the first time since she had returned. The days that followed on Dartmoor passed in an odd and unsettling silence. Even as the week went on, the mist persisted like a dimly recalled dream. With questions racing through her head, Eleanor split her time between caring for Storm, who had become a bit stronger and let her clean his wound without flinching, and observing the horizon. She had been shaken by the encounter with Lord Blackwood, and long after he had departed, she could still think about his hidden threats. She kept thinking that his fascination with wild horses, and Storm in particular, was anything but harmless. Nevertheless, despite her apprehension, nothing unusual occurred. No cars prowled the moor at night, and no odd guys loitered near the fence line. Everything appeared to be peaceful to the outer world. Eleanor, however, followed her instincts, and they were screaming danger. She became fixated on the peculiar mark on Storm's flank while she was in this state of limbo, which was half fear and half hope. She couldn't get the picture out of her head. It was too purposeful and too sharp to be the mark of a common robber or even a local farmer. Someone organized, someone who was concerned with more than the short-term profit of meat or hide, had wished to identify this pony. Eleanor couldn't sleep late one night and ended up staring at the ceiling while the house moaned in the wind all around her. With her phone in hand, she put on an old sweater, sat up, and padded downstairs to the kitchen. She looked through her emails, but there was still no response from her London-based pal. She scrolled through page after page in an attempt to find information about pony brands in the UK, but nothing came up. She went to the mudroom and put on her jacket, boots, and beanie in frustration. Perhaps some chilly air might help her think more clearly. The moon was a pale haze behind drifting clouds in the silent, chilly night. She strolled around the property, looking at the hedge line and inspecting the locks. There was a spark of possibility in every shadow. As she made her way back to the stable, Winston observed her with drowsy interest. Half awake, Storm's dark, glossy eyes blinked at her. Leaning on his warmth, she caressed his neck. Determination settled over Eleanor like armor as she prepared herself a pot of strong tea, and sat at the scarred kitchen table. She needed to know the meaning of that sign. Nothing came up when she did a reverse image search. She uploaded a grainy photo to an internet horse fan site. In response, someone said it appeared continental, possibly from Eastern Europe. None of the brands matched, but someone else gave a link to a news story concerning Spanish smuggling rings. With her knuckles white around her cup, Eleanor leaned back. What if the entire affair had been in her mind? What if it was merely a coincidence, her mind creating stories to divert her attention from the fact that she was still shattered and still fleeing her own shortcomings? Rain tickled against the glass as she sat in silence for a long time. Her pulse skipped a beat when she impulsively put illegal horse branding UK into a search box and scrolled past alerts about rural crime until she came across a forum post from a year ago that read, "Rare breeds targeted by international syndicate, beware of this symbol." A picture of a rudimentary, looping brand that was nearly comparable to Storm's was there. Breathlessly, she clicked through. Fear, rumors, and rage were all mixed together in the posts. A criminal organization known as the Sovereign's Menagerie allegedly paid local poachers to capture rare British horses for wealthy collectors abroad, according to a person going under the name Dartmoor Ranger. Other people commented on things like missing animals, destroyed evidence, and inaction on the part of authorities. As Eleanor traced the links, her hands trembled. Money exchanges, coded language, and even Lord Blackwood's name were mentioned in a chat regarding local enablers with connections. Her heart pounded. She took screenshots, sent it to herself, and copied everything. This was real, not some crazy conspiracy. She jumped when a sharp gust rocked the windows. Eleanor felt the darkness looming over her as she gazed up. It was Arthur Penhaligon on her vibrating phone. "Arthur, did you hear anything strange tonight?" Strangers were spotted close to the north boundary, according to some of Blackwood's men. "I figured you ought to be aware." Eleanor, at this time. "However, I discovered a bit about the brand. I must demonstrate." "Arthur, take caution. Never put your trust in strangers." Setting the phone aside, she gazed into the old kitchen's shadows. The moor was quiet outside, but she no longer felt isolated. She kept thinking about the weight of everything she had discovered, including Storm's account, the brand, the whispers, and Blackwood's covert warnings. She became acutely aware that she was involved in something far bigger and riskier than she had ever thought. Eleanor stood at the top of the property at dawn, holding her phone high and looking for a signal. Sending signals into the dark and waiting for a response made her feel like a lighthouse keeper. Finally, a new message arrived from her pal in London. "That symbol is trouble," said a friend. "It is linked to a smuggling network across Europe. They transport everything for collectors, including rare ponies and raptors. Incredibly private. It indicates that the animal is very valuable if you see it. Take caution. Real money and real risk are at stake." Eleanor's heart pounded. She gazed down at the undulating, eerie moor below as she stood on the hilltop, the wind chilling her cheeks. There was more to Storm than a wayward pony. He was a target in a world full of vicious individuals with connections, wealth, and influence. She had caught their attention, and even their anger, by saving him. Eleanor vowed when the sun finally broke the horizon. She would keep Storm safe no matter how dire things were. At all costs, she would reveal the truth. Furthermore, she couldn't and wouldn't turn back. A lone person, scarcely discernible in the golden mist, watched her from beyond the distant hedges down in the morning light. Eleanor felt a prick in her flesh. The image of Blackwood's icy grin burned into her mind as she squared her shoulders. This was only the start. The outside world seems to hold its breath. It was the charged silence before a storm, the feeling of eyes watching from just outside the ring of light from her antique porch lantern, and Eleanor could feel it. As though he also detected something strange about the evening, Winston, who is usually so calm in the nights, paced his stall and shook his head. The muscles under his rough brown coat were stiff, and Storm, lying in a thick bed of straw, pricked his ears at every slight sound. The moon and the waving branches outside threw shadows across the sturdy walls. Eleanor repeatedly inspected her bulky maglite flashlight, the feed bins, the first aid box, and the locks. Not that she really intended to use the ancient shotgun in the mudroom, but her nerves were as tense as piano wire, so she made sure it was loaded. Every board creaked and every blast of wind helped her stay focused as she walked around the house in silence. Her cell rang. Arthur sent another message. "Arthur, more tire tracks were discovered along the gully. Keep an eye out. Don't try to approach someone by yourself. If you observe anything, call." She answered. "Eleanor, I get it. Winston is in the stable with Storm. I'll remain vigilant." She paused, gazing out the kitchen window for a bit. The moor was a landscape made for secrets and ghosts, all rolling mist and shadows. She attempted to tell herself that she was exaggerating, that the gleam she had seen on the far side of the hedge was only dew, and that the footfall she had heard earlier was simply bad dreams. But she was wiser. In the same way that you sense a wild animal's presence before you see its eyes in the dark, she could sense the danger approaching. Close, sharp, and incorrect, a dog barked. Not one of the sheepdogs from the area. Multiple voices and a deep, unpleasant note. Eleanor felt her heart leap. Her senses intensifying, she flipped off the kitchen light. For a while, the only sound coming from her ears was the rush of blood as the barking ceased. The crunch of boots on gravel then came, faint but distinct. Her property was being moved. Holding her flashlight, she rushed along the rear hallway, avoiding the darkness. She looked out through a gap in the stable door. For a brief period, the moon shone through the clouds, casting a glittering radiance across the yard. Silently, 3 men with hunched, black bodies and low hands at their sides walked around the barn's edge. They wore headgear pulled down over their faces and unremarkable jackets. 2 large dogs with low muzzles and curled bodies were at their heels. Eleanor felt a knot in her stomach. With her thumbs shaking, she slipped her phone out of her pocket and texted Arthur once more. "They're here," Eleanor said. 2 dogs and 3 guys circle the barn. "I'm inside." She hardly had the courage to breathe. Storm picked up her nervousness and snorted. Winston felt the energy in the air and stamped. As her buddy had predicted, the men paused, one of them talking softly into a radio, his accent clipped and alien, possibly Eastern European. An order was yelled by the leader. The men dispersed, going around the stable. With a flashlight shining through the gaps in the boards, one knelt near the side entrance. Another gently rattled the latch as he tested it. Taller than the others, the third strolled up to the main barn door and pounded on it with a crowbar butt. "Lady Vance, please open up. Regards from Lord Blackwood. All we want is the pony. Nobody should be harmed." He had a silky yet nasty voice that was full of derision. The low, greedy growls of the hounds began. Eleanor felt her heart thumping in her chest. Her breath slowed as she crushed herself against the wall. She recalled all of the stories she had ever heard about failed robberies and tragic rural violence. Despite her doubts and determination, she held on to the ancient shotgun. She was unable to give them Storm. She refused. The men started to pry at the doors of the barn. The hinges moaned and the wood creaked. In the dark, the dogs' fangs flashed white as they barked and scratched at the planks. Eleanor tried to calm the horses by whispering to them. "It's okay. Shh. I refuse to allow them to touch you." At the far end of the barn, she heard a window smash. The glass crunched beneath his boots as one of the men climbed through. He waved his flashlight around, the brightness flickering across the faces of two scared horses, the gear hooks, and the bales of hay. After muttering something she couldn't comprehend, he yelled, "Here. This stall contains the branded ones." Hooves flailing, eyes wild, Storm reared. Two more individuals entered and closed in on the frightened pony as the man swore and retreated. Eleanor was aware that she could not wait for Arthur at this time. With a shotgun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, she pushed open the stall door. "Avoid him!" she yelled, her voice trembling with rage. The males were startled and froze. With a snarl, the leader stepped in her direction. "Simply put down the rifle, Lady Vance. We only desire what belongs to us. You get injured when you meddle." He made a motion. The hounds bared their teeth and lunged. Eleanor shot a warning into the earth. Hay and dirt burst in the cramped room. With a yelp, the dogs fled. The leader's visage just grew more stern as the men swore. He growled, "You're making a mistake. You were cautioned by Lord Blackwood not to interfere. This is not your battle." Sweat was chilling on Eleanor's skin as she held her ground. "Leave. I'm going to call the police. You don't deserve to be here." The men looked at each other. One sprang forward, clutching the barrel of the shotgun. Twisting, Eleanor struggled to free the weapon. They struggled for a horrible moment, groaning and swearing. Then headlights swept over the yard outside. When a car door banged, someone shouted, "Police! Put down your firearms." Arthur had shown up with two police in uniform. The men ran for the far end of the barn, pushing past Eleanor as they panicked, but Arthur was faster, his flashlight piercing the confusion. Two of the invaders were tackled by the officers, while the third sneaked away into the night with the dogs after him. Breathless, Arthur rushed through the barn with a shotgun. "How are you, Eleanor?" She trembled as she nodded, her veins still flooded with adrenaline. They attempted to capture Storm. They said they were sent by Blackwood. "They," she said, her voice breaking. A hand was placed on her shoulder by Arthur. "For the moment, it's over. We possess them. We have proof, too. This will not go unpunished." Eleanor was there, arms around his neck, repeating promises she meant to keep as Storm trembled and rolled her eyes. "I've got you. Now, nobody will harm you." The mist swirled outside, but Eleanor felt a glimmer of optimism for the first time in the entire night. She had resisted the darkness's attempts to seize her and the things she held dear. She was no longer the woman who fled from storms. And she was not going to give up, not now, never. The barn was a flurry of commotion and noise. As Arthur and the officers shackled the two guys they had apprehended and dragged them out into the yard, Eleanor could hardly hear herself thinking. Both the last escaping burglar and the barking dogs had vanished into the whirling mist. With his flanks heaving and sweat converting the dust on his coat into muddy stripes, Storm shuddered in his stall. Now that the immediate threat had passed, Winston was more courageous and craned his neck over the entrance, his eyes shining with concern and his ears pricked. Arthur gave Eleanor a glance. "Remain here. I'll request backup and ask them to look around." Eleanor's nerves were burning, but she nodded. Her hands trembled as the anger and terror boiled in her chest. Clinging to the shotgun, she became acutely conscious of its weight and the pain in her arms from the adrenaline that had rushed through her just minutes earlier. She was struck with the truth of what had just transpired. People had come for Storm, and not just any people, but well-organized, law-breaking individuals who worked for Lord Blackwood. If Arthur hadn't come, they could have succeeded in threatening her and almost overwhelming her. She forced herself to slow her heartbeat and breathe while closing her eyes. More to herself than to the horses, she muttered, "You're okay. You took the necessary action." She wiped perspiration from her forehead and took her phone out of her pocket. She scribbled a brief message to her friend in London with shaking hands, including a blurry picture of the brand on Storm's flank and a picture of the barn's broken window. "Eleanor, that's true. They came to get him. We require assistance. Inform everyone you know." Storm went into a frenzy as soon as she pushed send. His hoofs slammed against the boards as he reared in the stall, his eyes white and wide. Eleanor briefly worried that he may hurt himself, but then she realized what was frightening him. A shadow slid across the barn wall, indicating that someone was still outside, circling back, trying to complete what the others had begun. Eleanor tightened her hold on the shotgun, sprinted to the window, and looked out. A lone person, silhouetted against the dim moonlight, slipped through the fog. He moved deliberately, searching the yard with a torch beam slicing across the ground, and this time he wasn't rushing. Eleanor's blood became icy. Storm's terror turned to rage. The stall door shook on its hinges from the force of his kick. In an attempt to appear larger than he actually was, Winston whinnied while stomping and tossing his mane. With his beam racing over the barn doors, the intruder hesitated, unsure. Eleanor knew she needed to do something. She used a tactic she had learnt from years spent on the moor, where mobile phone signals faded and assistance was frequently miles away, to shove the shotgun under her arm and retrieve the flare pistol from the emergency pack. She threw the flare into the night sky and wrenched open the barn door. The entire yard was scarlet as the clouds were illuminated by a beautiful red arc. With his arms raised to protect his eyes, the stranger flinched back. It was then that Storm escaped. The door of the stall leapt open with a splintering boom. Fury and fear filled every muscle as Storm raced out of the barn. With his nostrils flared, eyes blazing, ears pinned, he was a living force. The man in the yard hardly had time to drop his lantern before Storm rushed upon him as he rode directly at him. The pony's exposed teeth snapped as his hooves hammered the ground. In an attempt to repel Storm, the intruder yelled and swung his arm, but Storm whirled and kicked out with his strong hind legs. Boots slipping in the damp grass, the man scrambled backward and sprawled into the dirt. Screaming Storm's name, Eleanor ran after him, but the wind blew her voice away. With a snort and pawing motion, Storm circled the man, urging him to stand up. It seemed as though the moor's natural untamedness had awoken, furious and unwavering, resolved to protect what was rightfully his. Arthur and the officers fled the disturbance. When they yelled for him to give up, the man merely stumbled to his feet and fled in desperation for the boundary fence. As if to challenge anyone else to approach, Storm chased him all the way to the very edge of the property before stopping, tossing his head and stamping the ground. Heart-pounding, frantic, Eleanor caught up. With a wild and tangled mane and a heaving chest, Storm stood in the moonlight. He turned to face her, and they looked at each other for a long time, a passionate, old connection between them. Gratitude, devotion, and a force greater than words. Arthur touched Eleanor's shoulder tenderly. His voice was subdued as he replied, "He saved you. You were truly saved by him." The stunned man was dragged back across the yard by the policeman. He had a scarred scalp and steely, cold eyes after losing his cap in the scuffle. "You're doing something wrong," he spat at Eleanor. "You have no idea who you're interacting with." Arthur merely gave a headshake. "We are sufficiently informed. And we have all the necessary proof." Eleanor's eyes stung with tears as she turned back to Storm. She caressed his neck, sensing the warmth beneath his wet garment, and the tremor in his skin. "I'm grateful, Storm. Thank you." Something changed inside Eleanor for the first time since her accident. She no longer fought just for herself. She fought for Storm, Winston, all the animals endangered by brutality and greed, and the land itself. Eleanor escorted Storm and Winston back to the shelter of the barn while police investigated the property, gathering evidence such as discarded radios, muddy prints, and the still smoking flare. She double-checked every shadow before bolting the doors and locking the windows. Storm shivered as he leaned toward her, yet he stood with pride, as though he had accomplished something admirable. Later, once the police had left with their detainees and the farm was once again peaceful, Eleanor sat in the hay with her horses by her side. Exhaustion and a strange bubbling exhilaration were left behind when the adrenaline subsided. They had survived, at least for tonight. Good had won out for tonight. She had no idea what the morning held. However, she was aware that she was no longer alone. She had both human and animal pals. She believed she had lost her strength. She also possessed Storm, a representation of her own unwavering spirit, and the untamed, wild moor. Eleanor muttered a promise she would see through to the end as the flare's afterglow vanished from the sky in the darkness. "I will never allow them to kidnap you, no matter who shows up. Not as I take a breath." The land itself appeared to respond, protecting her till daybreak, somewhere in the mist. There was a stillness over Dartmoor the morning after the chaos, the pale silence that seems to accompany every real storm. Light streamed through clouds in tiny golden streaks, and the mist moved back to the hilltops. With her horse's earthy warmth on either side, Eleanor woke up in the stable on a bed of hay. Her eyes were gritted and her body hurt, but for the first time in what seemed like years, her spirit was strangely at ease. Storm laid nearby, breathing evenly and slowly. Winston was standing close by, sleeping, his chin on the half-door, his elderly eyes wide awake. Eleanor gently stood up, extending her aching limbs, and listened for a long time without any noise, no yelling, no shattered glass, no feet on gravel. Only the distant call of a lark in the hedgerow and the soft sigh of horses. Through the night, she had survived. All of them had. She cleaned her hands and went to the yard after examining Storm's leg and noticing that the swelling was gradually going down. Outside, everything was in mild order. Arthur's Land Rover was parked close to the gate, 2 cop cars were on either side of it, and beyond that, a small group of people had assembled, including some interested townspeople, neighbours, and a BBC van that had already set up a tripod for a camera. Despite the knot in her gut, Eleanor straightened her shoulders and faced them. She was greeted first by Arthur. A victorious sparkle lit in his eyes despite his apparent fatigue. "Lady Vance, you're a hero today," he murmured quietly, out of earshot of the media. "The men, the equipment, the brands, and even the radio you snatched are all here. It will be difficult for Blackwood to spin this." Eleanor glanced over his shoulder to the officers packing the apprehended criminals into the rear of a vehicle. Their heads remained lowered, their faces displaying a mixture of fatigue and stubbornness. She glanced at one of them and experienced a flashback to her previous terror, but her bravery returned when she caught sight of Storm's wild mane through the barn window. Arthur put his hand on her arm. "They admitted it. Everything. Blackwood ran the ring," he said. "Today, we will raid his estate. If we have a say, there won't be any more traps on your property or any place else in Dartmoor." Overwhelmed, Eleanor nodded, relief and thankfulness tightening her throat. "I'm grateful, Arthur. I couldn't have accomplished this on my own." Arthur grinned. "You were not required to. The lesson here is that people, animals, and this untamed land are all interconnected." A BBC reporter with a camera in hand walked forward. "Lady Vance, what does it feel like to save one of the most valuable wild ponies on Dartmoor? And to have discovered a criminal organization at your very door?" Feeling the weight of the inquiry, Eleanor looked into her eyes. She had evaded attention, the arena, and her former life for years. She steadied herself now and took a breath. "I wasn't alone. Storm saved us all, including himself. He served as a reminder that you can fight for what's important even when you're scared or feel damaged." Winston walked over and let her to place a hand on his withers as she reached for him. "These creatures. In a sense, they are our family and our legacy. They are not worthy of being chased down or sold. Their residence is also on Dartmoor." The cameras made a sound. In the crowd, a small girl with a bright smile and filthy boots raised a hand hesitantly. "Miss, will Storm remain with you now?" Storm chuckled quietly and bent over the half-door to nuzzle the girl's hand as Eleanor knelt down to let her see him. Eleanor grinned through her tears and replied, "That's up to Storm. His soul is a part of the moor. When he's ready, I believe he will let us know." As the police completed their work, the gathering dissipated. Arthur persisted, keeping her informed of every development, how the proof from her images and the brand's records directly connected to the sovereign's menagerie, how Blackwood, initially in denial, soon gave way under interrogation and implicated his own men, and how, thanks to Eleanor's courage, law enforcement was finally dismantling the network that was responsible for dozens of illegal animal exports throughout Europe. The silence that ensued, however, was Eleanor's true triumph. She took care of Storm all afternoon. He didn't protest when she cleaned and bandaged him, and he even allowed her to take his temperature and give him some apples. Winston appeared to notice a shift as well. He watched over Storm as though imparting some age-old knowledge that only elderly horses could comprehend. After the chores were done and the final patrol car had left, Eleanor boiled tea in a beaten tin kettle over a tiny fire near the barn. With Storm and Winston grazing nearby and the moor rolling away in all directions, she sat with her back against the entrance. At last, the tension that had held her for so long started to release. Her world had shrunk to a pinprick of sorrow and terror as she thought of nightfall, the horse she had lost, the accident, and the suffering. Eleanor caressed Storm's nose and whispered, "You brought me back," as Storm gave her a gentle prod, seemingly able to read her thoughts. "You did, in fact." Arthur returned at dusk with the following news. "It is finished. Blackwood and all his guys are under arrest. One of the largest wildlife busts in UK history, according to the authorities. Thanks to you, they are even discussing new laws, a true change. Eleanor didn't bother to conceal the tears that filled her eyes. She felt Storm's silent strength as she placed her forehead against his. The three of them stood together in the last of the light as Winston pushed her side. Eleanor muttered, "I was avoiding my past, but I believe it's time to confront it. Perhaps even pardon it." Arthur knelt next to her and gazed at the hills. "You've already done so. Storm wasn't the only one you saved. Dartmoor was saved thanks to you." The fresh smell of grass and heather, the promise of a new season, was carried by the shifting breeze. Eleanor felt healed for the first time since her accident, not by discarding the past, but by confronting it and creating a future that respected it. Silently, softly, and gently, night stole in. Eleanor observed Storm and Winston, two spirits, one shaped by wildness, the other by years of devotion, grazing together in the moonlight. Eleanor made a final little fire beside the barn later, when the farm was still and only the stars could be seen. She finally felt at ease as she sat between Storm and Winston and listened to the horses breathing. She whispered, "You're free now, Storm," and the words echoed into the night. "Both of us are." And when the fire subsided and the moor began to sing its hidden melodies, Eleanor Vance discovered the atonement she had been seeking, not in triumph or retribution, but in the unspoken connection of forgiveness, trust, and community. The healing process had really started for her, Storm, and everyone who lived in Dartmoor. After a long, stormy night, dawn on Dartmoor usually arrived slowly, the lights slinking across stone walls and hills like a wary wanderer. The landscape beyond Eleanor's window felt clean that morning. Clouds floated languidly across a sky that appeared softer and wider than she recalled, and dew shone on the grass and gorse. Weeks had passed since Blackwood and his men were expelled from the moor, weeks since Eleanor Vance regained her courage and her position in the world, and weeks since the raid on her farm. Since then, each day had seemed like a silent miracle. She stretched under a quilt her mother had sewn years ago when she woke up before the sun, and for a few periods she lay motionless, enjoying the unique, delicious weightlessness in her chest. For so long, she had believed that her days would be characterized by suffering and regret, recollections of the tragedy, nightfalls passing, and the prematurely ended career. The pain in her heart, however, had subsided. The scar was still there, but it had softened and became something she could live with. Every morning, she made her first stop at the stable. She discovered Storm and Winston sleeping next to each other, their breaths blending in the golden light. Winston greeted her with a quiet whicker, growing older and grayer each year. Previously apprehensive and untamed, Storm's eyes now met hers with a silent confidence. The sole evidence of his ordeal was a thick white line where the wound on his leg had healed. He no longer flinched at every shadow and moved with a new confidence. Eleanor said, "Good morning, you two," in a gentle tone. "Storm, how about a ride today?" "Winston, you, and me alone. Only the hills and the sky, no storms, no poachers." Storm tossed his mane and snorted as though responding. Humming to herself, Eleanor laughed and went about her work. The routine of feeding, brushing, and mucking out felt like a boon rather than a hardship for the first time in a long time. Not only had she regained her position on this country, but she had also discovered her calling once more. The sovereign's Menagerie's demise and Blackwood's capture had become widely known. For days, the media had gathered at the gate, and Eleanor had given interviews, not for attention, but to keep the narrative alive. She had watched, sometimes incredulously, as charities and politicians hailed her as a hero and pledged more money and more legislation to protect wildlife. However, it was never about credit or headlines. The goal was to ensure that no other person or animal had to endure the same suffering that Storm had, or that she had endured following nightfall. That next morning, when the sun was up and the chores were over, Arthur came by and leaned on the gate as she walked the horses to graze. "Lady Vance, "It's your big day," he called. "I've heard that today is the official launch of your conservation trust. Are you prepared for the commotion?" Eleanor grinned, truly relaxed. "I'm as prepared as I will ever be. Won't you stay for the speeches? We need someone to stop the mayor from talking so much." Arthur smiled. "I wouldn't miss it. Eleanor, you have a debt to the moor. I also do." She waved him away, flushed. "The moor has no debt. I only took the proper action." After giving her a long look, he nodded to Storm. "What about him? After all, are you going to keep him?" Standing shoulder to shoulder, one representing her past and the other her future, Eleanor watched Storm and Winston cultivate grass. "It's not up to me," she muttered. "He's crazy. There's his house out there. However, he is free to stay as long as he desires. Now that the gate is open, he is free to enter and exit." In the field behind the manor, beneath a white marquee with bunting draped between the oaks, the Conservation Trust launch took place. Numerous residents arrived, along with kids from the local school, camera-wielding reporters, and representatives from animal rights groups across the United Kingdom. There were speeches, some evocative, some uninteresting, about the value of protecting the untamed beauty of Dartmoor, the pony's heritage, and the bravery required to defend what was right. With her hands calm and her voice crisp, Eleanor stood at the podium. Saving a single pony or even a single moor isn't the exclusive goal of this trust. It's important to keep in mind that we are not alone in this. Every living creature has a right to exist here, including people, animals, and grass blades. All of us are caretakers. Let's respect that." Children gathered around, sketching pictures of ponies and asking timid questions, as Storm and Winston grazed the edge of the crowd. Once unreachable, Storm let the most courageous among them to caress his neck and his eyes. Like a pro, Winston accepted nuzzles and apples. Eleanor sneaked away to the top of the closest ridge as the gathering dispersed and the sun started to slowly set. She could see the entire valley from there, including the ancient mansion, the stables, Arthur's cottage in the distance, and the boundless Dartmoor wilderness beyond. Winston walked slowly behind Storm as she followed. Eleanor gazed toward the horizon while resting her hand on Storm's withers at the summit. "I'll understand whatever you decide, Storm," she added quietly. "You deserve to be free." The pony stayed at her side for a while, his body warm against hers. Then he threw his head back and started to sprint toward the open hills, first at a trot and then at a gallop. Winston did not follow, but he whinnied. Together with her longtime companion, Eleanor watched Storm's shadowy figure fade in the waning light, a sliver of wildness and optimism vanishing into the territory he called home. Eleanor's eyes were pricked by tears, but they were tears of something richer and deeper than sadness. "This is the proper way to do it," she muttered. "Free? Every one of us." News spread swiftly as dusk approached. A Dartmoor pony with an odd white scar was spotted leading a group of people across the moor with pride and strength. Locals would occasionally see a lone woman with a faithful old gelding by her side standing at the edge of the fields, eyeing the hills. The story of Storm, the untamed pony who revived her, and Lady Eleanor Vance, who confronted her spirits and rediscovered her power, became legend. Whispered by the wind through the bracken, recollected in hoofprints on damp grass, and reverberated in children's laughter and the silent pride of those who loved the place, the story became an integral part of Dartmoor itself. Eleanor kept her eyes on the horizon at all times. The gate was never shut by her. On the clearest mornings, when the earth took its breath and mist curled over the hills, Storm would occasionally return, head high and eyes bright, a live reminder that healing, like the moor, never really ends. As a result, the wind, the grass, and the hearts of everyone who lived in Dartmoor continued to carry the echoes of their story.